Putin wasn't at war in Europe, I think we would be hugely concerned anyway. Ammonium nitrate is a very common fertiliser. However, it requires a very modest amount of what we call accelerant to create an explosion. And ammonium nitrate is incredibly explosive. It's the favoured weapon for fertiliser bombs, for Islamic State, for Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban.
Ship packed with 20,000 tonnes of Russian fertiliser. That's 10 times more than affected the Beirut blast 4 years ago. Is currently anchored off the Kent coast and seemingly headed for the English Channel. Let's get some more detail on this, speaking to Marco Foglioni, who is Director General of the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade. Marco, good evening.
Hi, good evening, Kate.
Just tell us a bit about this cargo ship. Where's it from and exactly what is on board?
Well, as you said, Kate, this headed from Russia down through the North Sea. And as it was off the coast of Norway, got caught up in a storm and has been damaged. It's got hull damage, it's got propeller damage, and indeed rudder damage. And so it's been trying to navigate its way. Initially, it was heading to the Canary Islands, but as a Maltese flagged ship, is now trying to make its way to Malta. But, with 20,000 tons of explosive fertilizer, this is a really tricky and difficult issue, and no ports along the way are willing to accept the ship to try and address the challenges it faces.
So it's Russian registered, but it's under a Maltese flag.
It's Maltese flagged, the MV Ruby. And it's got Russian fertilizer, ammonium nitrate on it. I say it was heading initially to the Canary Islands, and it did try over the weekend to divert through the Denmark Straits to head into the Baltic and head back to Russia, but it was not allowed the pilot ship to take it through. So it's now trying to head to Malta, and indeed the Maltese government has now said that unless they're able to unload the ammonium nitrate, they won't allow it to enter the Maltese waters.
OK. How is it allowed to sit in British waters? We understand that it's off the Kent coast. I mean, it's used the word anchored here when I'm just reading up some reports on it. It's basically situated off the Kent coast, just a few miles from Margate and Ramsgate. How is it able to be there on that in that territory?
So, okay, it's got an anchor support ship with it, which is keeping a fair distance, obviously,
right,
from it. And it's in international waters. It's not in the UK waters currently, judging from its beacon. But, of course, where it is located can only be a handful of miles from the SS Montgomery, which is a World War II munitions ship which has been stranded and sank off the Kent coast near the entry to the Medway in the Thames estuary. And of course, with 20,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, that is 10 times, as you highlighted, 10 times more ammonium nitrate than caused the devastating explosion in Beirut, the largest man-made non-nuclear explosion ever. And that is sat just off the Kent coast. Even worse, of course, is if that were to sink, and with cracks in the hull, we have to consider that as a possibility. The environmental damage that will cause will be immense, and it will cause ongoing disruption, of course, to what is a congested shipping lane, and disrupt even further the already disrupted and devastated global supply chains.
Yeah, and the reason why the SS Richard Montgomery is significant, the World War II wreck, is that holds around 1,400 tonnes of unexploded wartime ordnance, so, military supplies, weapons, ammunition, etc. What can be done about it? Sitting in international waters, it is, as you say, damaged, cracks in the hull, sinking is a risk. It's got this huge amount of explosive material on board. What can be done?
Well, look, with the damage it's got, or the suggested it's got, with the damage to the hull, to the propeller and to the rudder, it's close to impossible to try and resolve those issues while the ship is at sea. It does need to get to port, but quite frankly, no port is willing to take it with that amount of dangerous chemicals on board. So this is really a Gordian knot of complexity, as to how this gets resolved. As I say, no port so far that's been approached is willing to take it.
And this will be the case for UK ports as well, presumably.
I'm pretty sure it will be the same for UK ports. So how we overcome this, and of course it is currently, as you say, at anchor or not moving at least just before it gets into the channel, which is 21 miles wide. If something were to happen while it was transiting through the channel itself, this would be a hugely problematic issue for global shipping.
So if it does get into the English Channel, and that material aboard was to explode, I mean, this is a fantasy scenario now, but just so we can understand, how far would the effects be felt?
Well, the explosion in Beirut caused devastation for about 6 kilometers and further damage beyond that, but real devastation for a distance of about 6 kilometers. So you multiply that by 10, and it gives you a sense of just how dangerous this could be. But whilst it's at sea, the likelihood of the explosion is minimal, though there is a chance. The bigger issue is the environmental damage should the ammonium nitrate start to leak out of the ship and contaminate the sea, damage the seabed. And of course, if that were to happen, shipping through the channel would have to be diverted to avoid further shifting the pollution through the channel.
Look, it's, as I said, a curious and concerning story. Incredible, really.
Broken down ship anchored just off the coast of Kent. It's loaded with 10 times more fertiliser than caused the apocalyptic... I can't say that word. I wish people wouldn't put it in scripts.
That's why they do it.
Yeah, with apocalyptic 2020 Beirut blast, a very significant Beirut blast. You know exactly which one we're talking about. It came on just after we came on air as Times Radio, if you remember, that massive blast. And it was because of fertiliser mis-stored in Beirut. There's now 20,000 tons of this stuff in this ship, which is broken down just off the coast of Kent. How worried should we be? Jacob Carsbo, as an associate at the Danish security think tank Think Europa, joins us now. Jacob, good morning to you.
Good morning.
How do we assess this risk then? Because we've become aware, haven't we, of this problem of fertiliser being stored can be dangerous.
Yeah, indeed. As we saw in Beirut, where an explosion killed more than 300 people and sent the whole city, rocking. It was a terrible blast, and this is 7 to 10 times larger. So the impact would be absolutely massive. Now, there's a lot of very strange and suspicious things that have gone on with this particular ship from Russia right from the outset. So how broken down it is off the coast of Kent, I'm not too sure at this moment, but I'll explain that if you like.
Yeah, try to explain, because people can't really understand this. Presumably, fertiliser gets shipped from A to B in order for the person at A to sell it to the person at B. Why hasn't that happened here?
Exactly, that's the big question. And if you look at the sailing pattern of this particular ship, it doesn't look like the intention has been to sail this shipment from A to B. Right from the outset, it set off in the White Sea, south of the Kola Peninsula in northern Russia, some weeks ago, and apparently it got grounded, hit something. But what was odd then was it continued around the Kola Peninsula, past the big Russian port of Murmansk. Didn't feel any need to go in that large Russian harbor where it could have been looked after, and then passed north of Norway. And then suddenly it went off course and pulled in at the Norwegian big harbor and city of Tromsø, where the harbor is located right, next to the city. And the Norwegian authorities found out what the cargo was and asked the ship to remove itself from the city. And then next thing, it anchors up near military installations in northern Norway. Now the explanation for pulling up and anchoring next to these places at Tromsø was that there was a big storm. Now there was some wind, but not a big storm for this size of a ship. But then they used these damages to the ship as the explanation. But what happens a few days later is it goes out to sea again. Speeds no apparent when you track it. There was no deviation from the course that was set, and it was steaming ahead. No worries, and the Norwegian coastline is long, as you know. And then when it got further south, next to the city of Bergen, then again, this highly unusual sailing patterns repeated itself, and it started to wither a little bit and stray off course, and cruised around some of the oil rigs and natural gas installations that are very that this area is really crowded with installations. Critical infrastructure. And again, the Norwegian authorities didn't like that. Next thing is, this shipment was originally supposed to gone to the Canary Islands, apparently. And then suddenly they changed the destination to the Lithuanian port of Klaipėda, where they said we're going to offload it in Lithuania and go through the Danish and Swedish waters and the great belt that separate the two largest Danish islands. And then it started to get really suspicious.
It's pretty suspicious already, Jacob. So basically what you're saying is it's because it's been moving from Russia through various pieces of European critical infrastructure, being pushed away each time, is now ended up on Kent. So the suspicion, I mean, should we say what the suspicion is? The suspicion is this is being done deliberately to be a threat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that the Russian authorities would risk, weaponizing this ammonium nitrate, because that would be too obvious and too massive. My main line of thinking is that they're testing the Norwegian authorities and afterwards the Danish and Swedish authorities, seeing how much of a cooperation is there. Are they organized? What happens if we put this really, really dangerous cargo in sensitive areas next to a city, next to military installation, next to critical infrastructure? And then they want to, see the pattern that we react, and are the British authorities prepared? And have they spoken to the Danes and the Norwegians and the Swedes that were involved? This kind of thing.
That is terrifyingly plausible, Jacob. The idea of it's just basically pushing against the fence to check for a weak spot on something that they're not going to blow it up, but they're just going to see what happens with international cooperation. That sounds terrifyingly plausible, Jacob. What an amazing story that is.
I'm joined now by Jens Wenzel, a defence analyst at Nordic Defence Analysis. Jens, how was this ship allowed to sail in the first place?
Well, that's a very, very good question, but I guess it was bound initially to Palma de Mallorca after leaving Kalashka in the Kola Peninsula up north. And then, as you probably know, then it had a grounding just after having left the port, and then continued down to Tromsø, where it apparently anchored up within Norwegian territorial waters, but being restricted by the Norwegian authorities with a 500-meter safety zone around it, and then consequently asked to leave Norwegian territorial waters afterwards. After that, this ship had, let's say, a little bit of a strange course down towards south, and was actually meant, the next port of destination was Klaipėda in Lithuania, but the authorities there did not allow it to enter unless it had emptied its cargo, as you know. And that's, of course, the problem with this ship is that after having been denied, the Danish authorities required that it had pilot and a tugboat if it should transit through these waters, but after having been denied by Lithuanian authorities, it has lived a life of, let's say, floating around,
Sure.
and let's say this femme fatale of a ship has then left south in search of a harbor. And the problem is here that nobody really wants to take this the ship on because of the fairly dangerous cargo.
Well, I mean, how dangerous is it, Jens? Is it? I mean, is it?
Well,
one thinks of the horrendous explosion in Beirut. Is this actually a similar type situation, or are people a bit too worried?
Actually, to my knowledge, this fertilizer or ammonium nitrate is much cleaner in its sense than the one which was in Beirut. But under the right circumstances, of course, it is a dangerous cargo. The ship is transporting dangerous goods, so to speak. But under the certain conditions, it's dangerous if it is in some way brought to an explosion. That would be the same as a 10 kiloton bomb going off, and I mean that would create a bit of a crack in the ocean, so to speak. But under normal conditions, it's quite safe, especially on a ship which is meant to be transporting these things. But under, let's say, very unfortunate circumstances, for example, if it had a fire on board, this ammonium nitrate could eventually blow up under the right conditions. And that's, of course, the reason why nobody wants to take it on, unless this ship can find a port which has the right handling facilities. And that's the big challenge here, to find that right port, because it has to be unloaded, it has to be go to a shipyard which can repair. It's both the rudder, the propeller, there are cracks in some of the ballast tanks, and to my knowledge, the bow thruster isn't working either. So that is probably also the reason why this femme fatale of a ship has been, let's say, being followed by a tug all the way down there. Especially that was the requirements if it should pass through Danish waters.
Jens,
I'm not aware that.
Yeah. When Jens, I mean, briefly before I let you go, where do you expect it to end up? Because it's meant to go to Malta, but Malta says it won't take it. So how do you see the story is likely to end, or will it not end? Will it just end with the ship at sea, just rotting out in the deeps?
Right. This ship is a Lebanese operated a Syrian owner. It's a Russian cargo. I mean, it has simply the owner has simply to find this port, let's say, which will be willing to take the load on, and that could be anything from, I mean, French ports down to Spanish ports into the Mediterranean Sea. If there's any ship or port willing to take the ship, but that's the big question. And until that ship has found a port, a safe haven to unload its cargo, it cannot be repaired.
Sure.
And unfortunately, I think we'll be seeing a ship floating around for some time, unless that ship owner finds a suitable place to unload the cargo.
Thank you very much indeed, Jens Wenzel, who's a defence analyst at Nordic Defence Analysis.
Putin has had to rely on a shadow fleet of increasingly unregulated and under-repaired ships. There's now reports of a Maltese-flagged cargo ship filled with 20,000 tons of ammonium nitrate fertiliser that has come from Russia, sat just off the south of the UK coast. But how dangerous is that amount of a sort of potentially explosive material?
You know, if Putin wasn't at war in Europe, I think we would be hugely concerned anyway. Ammonium nitrate is a very common fertilizer. However, it requires a very modest amount of what we call accelerant to create an explosion. And ammonium nitrate is incredibly explosive. It's the favored weapon for fertilizer bombs for Islamic State, for Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. And the Taliban killed many British soldiers in Afghanistan using ammonium nitrate bombs. I was involved in the remediation of Beirut port a few years ago when 2,500 tons of ammonium nitrate blew up when a firework ignited it, creating the largest conventional explosion on Earth. So we've now got a ship, which apparently is in a very poor state with 20,000 tons. if that explodes, it will explode with the power of 20,000 kilotons of conventional explosives. This is 2 Russian tactical nuclear weapons, which Putin has been threatening Ukraine with only today. So the potential for a massive explosion is there. And if this thing is out of control, the fact that it's Russian and is drifting around in the English Channel is a huge concern. And the sooner that it's out of British waters and sent back whence it came, the better. So, yeah, the potential for disaster is high. The fact that Putin has been threatening the UK with some sort of a massive attack, we know that his nuclear missiles, the tactical ones, won't reach us. They have a range of about 400 miles, and we're at least 1,500 miles from the Russian border. So, yeah, you put all these things together. One doesn't want to, panic the people of the south coast of the UK, because I'm sure the Royal Navy and the Border Force and everybody else is monitoring this very closely. But this is not something we should disregard. We can breathe a sigh of relief when it's way out into the Atlantic or back at Russia, because the potential there is huge for a massive explosion.
This ship is not too far off the coast of where Dungeness nuclear power station sits. Presumably there are precautions in place already to prevent blast damage to that sort of site.
Yes, absolutely, and I don't think we want to conflate things to make them perhaps worse than they really are. But certainly, if Russia meant this as some sort of weapon, then blowing it up close to a nuclear power station would exacerbate that. However, having said that, there is very strict security and measures around all the nuclear power stations in the UK to make sure that they operate safely. And I'm sure that if there was any indication that this ship is heading in that direction deliberately, then it will be intercepted and moved as quickly as possible out of the way. So, I don't think that's something that the people of Kent should be overly concerned about at this stage.
Today, Putin has issued a new set of warnings of nuclear escalation in the war in Ukraine. What exactly has he been saying, and why do we think he's chosen to issue them now?
Well, I think, first of all, he's issuing them now because he knows that President Zelensky is in New York at the moment, having meetings with President Biden, Sir Keir Starmer, and other Western leaders. And Zelensky is desperate for additional weaponry, and in particular, long-range missiles, precision missiles that can strike into Russia. So the timing is entirely because of that. And I think because Putin knows that the long-range missiles could make a difference. I personally think Putin is in real trouble at the moment. I've written extensively over the last 7 days about the collapse of morale of the Russian military, a leaked report coming out of the Kremlin in the last few days of why the Kursk operation was such a success for Ukraine. And essentially that Kremlin report says that hundreds, if not thousands of conscripts just gave up without a fight. There's also been a spate of suicides on the front line. So to me, as a soldier of 35 years, that shows an army in real decline. Allied to that, Governor of the Central Bank, Ljubljana, this week, although last week gave a talk about raising the interest rates to 19%, having said in the summer that would be disastrous to the economy. She also said that the sanctions were really beginning to bite and having a very serious effect on Russia. So when you put all that together, Putin is really running out of things he can do. And he's threatened the nuclear peace really from the get-go. And I hope that the leaders in New York realize it's complete bluff and bluster. And his assertion today is he's going to change the rules for using his nuclear capability. Well, his doctrine would have allowed him already to fire nuclear missiles. One of the key three elements, which would allow the president to press the red button, is an invasion into Mother Russia. Now, Kursk is exactly that. About 10,000 Ukrainian troops have held an area 1,500 square kilometers for nearly 2 months now. He could have pressed the button at the beginning, but he knows that he can't. His tactical nuclear weapons only have a range of about 400 miles. He would need to get them right to the Ukraine border to launch them within 400 miles of that border. And I know, having studied this a long time, and Putin knows, that the international community will see that happening and could prevent it. And if Zelensky has these long-range precision-guided missiles, he can do it himself. So Putin's nuclear capability is really nullified, and I think he's clutching at straws. And I hope that, as I said at the beginning, the leaders in New York appreciate that. This is Putin, to use to not overuse a sort of boxing vernacular, is absolutely on the ropes, and it's up to the West to deliver the killer punch. And UK Storm Shadow could be a very significant part of that killer punch.
A cargo ship currently anchored off the coast of Kent and carrying thousands of tons of potentially explosive fertiliser is set to travel through UK waters. That is the latest as we understand it. If ignited, the ship known as the Ruby could explode with more power than the Nagasaki nuclear bomb. Jacob Karsbo, he's an associate at Think Europa, said the Russian boat has taken a very suspicious route.
My main line of thinking is that they're testing the Norwegian authorities and afterwards the Danish and Swedish authorities, seeing how much of a cooperation is there. Are they organized? What happens if we put this really, really dangerous cargo in sensitive areas next to a city, next to military installation, next to critical infrastructure? And then they want to, see the pattern that we react, and are the British authorities prepared?
I'm joined now by Andrew Surdy, who's a professor of the International Law of the Sea. What a fascinating job at Southampton University. Good evening, Andrew.
Good evening, Kate.
Thanks so much for joining us. Look, how much do you know about this ship? It's a Maltese flag cargo ship carrying thousands of tons of potentially explosive fertiliser.
Well, beyond what you've said, not a great deal. What I have seen reports of are that it's owned by a Russian individual or perhaps a Russian company, and that perhaps gives an added dimension to the number of states that might have a stake in what happens to this ship.
Okay, and look, the BBC's reporting that the ship is set to travel through UK waters at the moment. Well, certainly when we picked up on the story last night on the show, we broke it live on Times Radio. It was in international waters. So if the ship is and it's kind of sort of somewhere off the Kent coast at the moment, sort of between the Kent coast and the Thames estuary, what are the ramifications if it travels through UK waters?
Well, as I understand it, it's heading towards Malta, which is where it's flagged, and that means it's got no choice really but to pass through the Dover Strait. That will take it through UK territorial waters, and in that particular part of the world, there's a regime known as transit passage, which means that the coastal states, the UK on one side and France on the other, have no chance, no legal standing to interrupt that passage. So they simply have to let it go on its way and hope for the best in terms of nothing untoward happening.
Okay. So that is, I mean, we had heard yesterday that that Maltese authorities had told local media that the ship can only enter the country if it empties its cargo beforehand. The destination is listed as Malta, but they've put that caveat in there. Could that be possible? I mean, again, this is, potentially highly explosive fertiliser. It would cause a blast much bigger than we saw in Beirut back in 2020, I think it was, when that, huge store of fertiliser blew up.
Well, Malta, as the flag state, is entitled to give instructions to the master of the ship in terms of where it goes and possibly where it doesn't go. But at the end of the day, there's no other state that has an obligation to admit a ship to its ports in this kind of situation. So it's really got nowhere else to go apart from Malta or perhaps back to Russia from where it started.
Okay. Interesting. Several other nations have said, well, we don't want to take it, even in the interest of getting the ship repaired. So at the moment, as we understand it, it is basically waiting for appropriate conditions to refuel at sea, and then it will pass through the English Channel on the way to Malta. And I'm sure, I don't know how you watch ships normally, Andrew, whether there's something akin to flight tracker for ships, but I'm sure everyone's going to be watching it closely.
Well, there are websites where you can track ships' progress as they move across the oceans.
Do you instinctively feel that the ship is suspicious? You heard there from Jacob Carsbo, who felt it was something of a test. It's not sort of meant to explode or anything, but he felt that it was a test by Russia to look at how we would respond to a ship of this type in international waters.
Well, that's a possible explanation for some of the unusual manoeuvrings it's taken in terms of ships, or rather in terms of the ports to which it's sought access over the past few days and been denied it. On the other hand, we don't really know what's in the minds of the people who are responsible for giving it its instructions. So that's as good as guess as any, I suppose, but we simply don't know.
Well, it is a curious story indeed, and I'm sure everyone will be very relieved when it's made it through the English Channel. As we understand, it's not started that journey yet. It could well have done, of course. I'm just giving latest reports here. Thank you so much for being with us, Andrew Surdey, Professor of the International Law of the Sea at Southampton University. Good to speak to you. Thank you.
The Russian ship loaded with 20,000 tonnes of explosive fertiliser is passing through the English Channel. It's being monitored by the British Coast Guard. Now, the vessel left Russia last month. Various ports have turned it away because of concerns over its cargo, and it's got damage to its rudder and its hull, but it was kind of signed off, I think, by the Norwegians to carry on its journey. I've no idea where it's actually going. We might find out more from Nicholas Leach. He's the editor of Ships Monthly magazine. Welcome to the show, Nicholas. You're obviously on board a ship because we can barely hear you, but let's hope we can get a better line. Do you know where the ship is going?
It's not quite clear where it's going. Just one correction: it's not Russian. It's Maltese flagged, and it's not. It says Russian linked, but I'm not quite sure how it was linked, other than that it picked up some cargo in Russia.
Uh-huh.
But no, it's not clear where it's going. It's not clear what it's doing. It's been refused entry by several countries, including Denmark, and it has recently been reported to be in the North Sea somewhere, but nobody seems to want it.
And why not? Because of its cargo or because of the condition of the ship?
I think both. I think if you've got a ship that's damaged and supposedly struggles to manoeuvre, you don't want it docking in your port with a cargo that could potentially explode.
I shouldn't laugh. I mean, I agree with you that if you can't move your ship around safely and you've got 20,000 tonnes of explosive effectively on board. But doesn't that then answer the next question, which to a certain extent, sailing through the Channel is probably the safest bit of the journey?
Well, I don't. I mean, it's better to sail than to dock in a port, but the Channel is extremely busy.
Yes.
Or hit another ship or something. I mean, I don't know. I don't know whether it will even be allowed to go through the Channel. The ship owner is trying to find a port where they can offload this cargo. I'm not sure where exactly where it was meant to be offloaded anyway, and why they can't offload it there. But or they could transfer the cargo to other ships which are in a better condition.
There must be huge protocols that surround the transport of dangerous materials on the high seas. I mean, if you're, for the sake of argument, taking some uranium from A to B or whatever, there would be enormous international regulations that would surround what kind of quality of ship and so on and so forth, wouldn't there?
Well, absolutely, but if your ship's been damaged, that kind of goes against those conventions, those standards, and I guess what do you then do when the ship isn't in a fit state to dock safely? It's not surprising ports have refused entry. I mean, there are conventions and ships are often inspected by coast guards or the MCA, the Maritime Coast Guard Agency in Britain. They have to conform to regulations in terms of crew standards, onboard safety procedures, fitness of the actual ship, and they can be detained by the coast guard. So they might dock in a port in Britain, be inspected, and then not allowed to leave because they don't meet the standards. But in this instance, the ship's at sea. It got damaged in a storm, went aground, cracked hull, damage to the propeller, floated off again, and now nobody wants it. So you wouldn't want to be on board it, would you?
You certainly wouldn't. That is good old British understatement there from Nicholas Leach, the editor of Ships Monthly magazine, on the orphan ship, which just happens to be carrying 20,000 tonnes of highly explosive fertiliser. I think the Russian link is that the nitrate fertiliser comes from Russia. But it is, as you say, it's called Ruby. She's called Ruby, and it's a Maltese flag cargo ship, and it's floating off the Kent coast at the moment. Now,